It's my very, very great pleasure to introduce two of my esteemed colleagues from the Jus Ad Astra Space Law and Human Rights in Space project, Jonathan Lim and AJ Link, who are going to talk to us today about the gravity of health and human rights in space. Thank you very much, John and AJ.
Awesome. Thank you, Arena. Hi, everyone. My name is Jonathan Lim. I'm the project goalie to Jus Ad Astra, and my colleague here, AJ Link, is the research director with the project as well. And what Jus Ad Astra is about is an international legal project focused on examining the intersections between human rights and space, highlighting the fundamental relevance of international human rights law in advancing human activities across the final frontier. And as part of the 2023 International Humans in Space Conference, this fireside chat and Q&A will explore the fundamental importance of human rights in the outer space context as it relates to the right to health and the physiological impact of gravitational environments and gravity upon the human body. Now, with an increasing number of people, astronauts, commercial astronauts, space tourists, traveling or about to travel to space, this raises fundamental concerns, ethical, legal, surrounding the impact of human spaceflight activities and long-term human presence in space, and in particular the right to health, safety, and dignity of human beings in outer space. And for our fireside chat between myself and AJ, we're looking to hold maybe about 45 minutes where we'll go through a series of questions and sort of draw out this topic in broader length. And then for the remaining time, we will then devote to open for Q&A with the members of the audience, should you be interested. But yeah, AJ, did you have anything to say before we roll on to the questions?
Hey everyone, yeah, I'm AJ. I'm a black guy with a beard, pink hat on, and a green shirt. And I just want to say thank you for having us, Rowena, and excited to chat, John, as always.
So yeah, just to start off, I guess, for those who are new, unaware, what are human rights, AJ? What do you see as human rights from your perspective?
Oh, so I think when you talk about human rights, there's the legal human rights, international human rights law framework, but then there's kind of the broader conception of human rights as a lot of people outside of the legal profession view it. And I think for me, international human rights law is, fundamentally based in a system where you have documents, treaties, principles that are outlined in how states, state actors, but also individuals should be protecting one another. So some of the characteristics that we talk about are that universal or human rights are universal. We say universal on Earth. I actually was just talking to someone about this, but really we just mean globally, right? I think that's really interesting, especially John, because we work in space, right? Most things aren't technically universal. They're not even like localized to the solar system. But I think, making sure that they apply to everyone, that they're inalienable. So there's this distinction in human rights with human rights that are non-dirigible, which means you cannot move from them. But I think one of the important characteristics that we should be aiming for, and that's aspirational in human rights, is that they're inalienable to all folks, whatever their situation, wherever they are. They're also interdependent. Oh, go ahead, John. Yeah, I'm just rambling on. Go ahead.
Absolutely, but I'll see beyond just the pure legal aspect of human rights in this high level with regards to its use within international forms, within international law. I think human rights is definitely a tool for ordinary people to use, to leverage in order to uphold basic human dignity, health, and safety in all contexts as well, and to empower those who are vulnerable across anywhere in the world.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to kind of the distinction between legal human rights and human rights as a legal framework, and then to your point, human rights as a tool for individuals to say that this is how my rights, my dignity should be respected, beyond simple legal black letter law definitions of what human rights are or are not. Like this is the aspiration of how we should be protecting human dignity in general. So I completely agree with that.
Awesome. And I guess just moving on from that to question two, what do you see as the intersections between human rights and space?
Well, I think from a legal perspective, international law applies in space, right? You think about the Outer Space Treaty and how it explicitly says that international law applies. I think that's
But what is this outer space treaty for our audience?
Yeah, my bad. So the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 is the fundamental space law document. It is a treaty that was produced within the United Nations framework. I think of it as a human rights treaty. I know a typical understanding of it isn't, but I think the aspirations in the Outer Space Treaty and how it defines space as something that is the province of all of humanity is a really aspirational kind of thing. So I think carrying the protections of human rights and the ideas, John, to your point of what respect for dignity means into space is super important. I think something that we do at the Jus Ad Astra project that's really interesting is thinking about how these human rights laws and ideas may have to change for space, but also how space can fundamentally change our perception of human rights here on Earth. And I think that's really interesting and probably one of the favorite parts of the work that we do.
Absolutely, and I guess the way that I usually put it towards the members of the audience is that there's two sort of intersections that you can look at between human rights and outer space. First is the use of space applications, remote sensing, satellites, space-related developments and research in order to benefit terrestrial rights issues. So like use of Earth observation data to help with monitoring climate change, to help with agriculture, to help with international security. And then there's the other intersection, which is more nascent, but in development, is the extraterritorial extension of the rights that we hold at the moment on Earth in human rights and extending that to human presence in outer space and how humanity is going to use that in the future. But yeah, I guess moving on to question 3 then, how do you think that human rights can protect human presence and activities in outer space?
So I think human rights provides a template for safety and dignity. Like we can talk about the International Space Station Agreement and how there's a code of conduct, an International Space Station Code of Conduct, and how that takes a human rights type framework on the responsibilities that we have to one another. I also think, and I know we only talked about the Outer Space Treaty, but there are 5 main treaties, and I think at least 3 of them are really focused on human rights. So the Outer Space Treaty we talked about, and the province of all mankind, or humanity, right? We need to update our language. But also the Rescue and Return Agreement, especially for astronauts and what they're entitled to in terms of their safety and protection. And then also the Moon Agreement, which, a ton of people haven't signed, but I think that's another aspirational document. So when we talk about, what human rights can do, it can shape the way we do space activities and space exploration. It can shape how we decide to build our spacecrafts, our agreements, our lunar activities, what it means to interact with one another on a celestial body that isn't planet Earth. I think human rights has the ability to shape all that, right? So this week is the Human Rights Week, International Human Rights Week, if I'm not mistaken. I think the days change in Australia, but yeah. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was signed. Oh man, John, is it 75 years now?
I think so, yeah, about there.
Yeah. So a document like that, 60 years. I don't know. 75, 60 years. I think having a document like
1948.
1948, so 75. So having a document like that I guess a lot of people don't actively look to shape the way we go to space, I think can have a really massive impact. And I think more people honestly should be looking at the human rights framework to guide their space activities.
Absolutely. And I guess that flows on to our next question as to what steps governments have taken to support human rights in space. I know you mentioned the Outer Space Treaty, you mentioned the 5 subsidiary treaties under that as well. But what about from a norms-based perspective and agency to agency or so forth?
Yeah, so I think, and John, I'd actually be interested to hear your opinions as someone who's outside of the US and Australia, usually works through the international system. But from a US perspective, it's very much about shaping norms and those norms being non-binding. So you're seeing a lot of things done at the state level rather than the international level at the UN and in COPUOS, which is the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space at the UN. And I think that's both good and bad, right? We talked earlier about the broad application, the universality of human rights at the international level. But when states are doing things from their own perspectives, it kind of impacts the universality of it, right? So different states have different ideas about what the norms should be in space. So I'm actually interested in your thoughts about how this move towards norms at the state level and on state to state basis in terms of agreements is going to impact the universality of human rights.
Absolutely. Well, at the moment, I think what we're looking at is, since development of human presence in space is still an ongoing endeavor, the opportunity to institute norms of responsible behavior, state-to-state agreements, many-lateral agreements, provides individual governments with the latitude to see where it goes for the moment. And then once they see the risks, once the risks are realized, that's when they'll take action. Unfortunate as it may be, that states don't have the foresight to act proactively in addressing human rights issues as much. But yes, I see that over time, as the risks become realized, as unfortunately more incidents happen in space, there will be the I guess the ruling over human rights cases within, say, regional human rights bodies and within the international forums as the UN and the UN Human Rights Council. And that is when we'll start to see it come in force, not just within international customary law as it stands, but within international agreements and conventions and treaties over time. All right. And I guess just the final question on this front is, how can governments coordinate in space in support of human rights looking forward? How do you think, AJ?
I think we're seeing what that type of framework looks like when you look at something like the Artemis Accords. I know we talked about the International Space Station and that code of conduct that was developed, in collaboration with a bunch of different groups. So I think there is a framework for that. I'm skeptical of doing things outside of the United Nations. I know that UN COPUOS works off consensus, which means things are really slow. You don't get a lot of documents out of that, or at least binding documents. But when you do, that means everyone's agreed to it, right? But it's becoming harder and harder. So, I think there are frameworks, but I'm not sure that non-binding frameworks are the best thing for human rights, right? Because we talked about how we want human rights to be binding, to have binding responsibilities to protect people's dignity. And so I don't know if non-binding frameworks are the best way to go about human rights protections in space. What do you think, John?
I think, yeah, there's obviously a need for states to bring up the language of human rights, use it more proactively within their national space policies. I mean, we've seen hints of it, like the 2020 US National Space Policy, which mentioned human rights more in the traditional civil and political sense. But there's a need to recognize both civil and political, but also the economic, social, and cultural aspects of human rights by governments in outer space. And in that sense, there's also a need, I think, for governments to coordinate with the private sector. I mean, right now we're seeing more activity from, say, SpaceX, Blue Origin, who are leading the front in commercializing space and making space more widely available to the public. And so there's a need for states to work more actively with these private space companies, and while also adhering to the international obligations under international space law, such as the Outer Space Treaty. Awesome. All right, so we'll move on to the next set of questions then, more guided. So first off, so what do you see, AJ, as the connection between human rights and health?
Well, you talked about economic, social, and cultural rights, but also I think there's civil and political rights that kind of bleed into protecting the right to health. Thinking about safety, thinking about access to medical care and treatment, but also there's economic, social, and cultural rights that come there too. And I think the distinction in the international community that a lot of folks have between first order rights, which are civil and political rights, versus second order rights when you talked about economic, social, and cultural rights, is not great. I know that's mostly based on them being two different treaties, right? So there's two fundamentally different documents for them. But I think we shouldn't view the right to health as, social, cultural, economic, or civil and political. Like it's all embodied, right? You need to be able to have, some level of health in order to participate in civil and political society, right? You have to have some level of health in order to enjoy your cultural rights, your social rights. So for me, I think
A degree
we
of
need,
interdependence. Yeah, definitely.
yeah, like you said, I think that is something I hope space can do to show people that without things like the right to health, the right to a breathable atmosphere or a healthy environment or drinkable water, it's really hard for you to participate and use your other rights. Like you said, it's interdependent. So for me, one of the things that I hope for in space is that it really shows people that we really have to center the right to health, because it's really hard to participate with anything, in anything else if you don't have, access to care, right? And so I want to be clear. So talking about international days, it was International Day of Persons with Disabilities last week on December 3rd. So I want to be clear that the right to health isn't necessarily the right to have full health all the time, but the right to have access to care and to have your supports and your needs met, whatever that might be. And I think, again, John, we've talked about this a lot over the years, like what it means to have access to health and healthcare in spaces is going to be fundamentally different. And to your point, we don't know what that means right now.
Absolutely. So I see it from the conception that at its center, firstly, with this connection between human rights and health, is that core right, the right to health. So the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, recognizes the right to health as the right to an adequate standard of living. And this is also reinforced under the International Covenant on Civil, Economic, and Social Rights under Article 12. And then from that, under that core right to health, we draw out those spokes into interdependent rights, like you stated, right to education, right to work, right to life, so forth. And yeah, so moving on to question 2 then, how would you see us?
John, I think part of the issue in space is, at least from a US perspective, the US is very active and dominant in space. But these agreements, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is technically not a binding legal document, right? And even the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights is a document that the U.S. hasn't ratified, and so it's interesting how the U.S. can be so dominant in the space sector without, at least at the international level, being part of these agreements and, historically not prioritizing the human rights of other people. So I think that that's really interesting too.
And going more into space law, international law jurisprudence, I mean, the way that the US has acted to date, and elements of state practice and so forth. All of this means that under, say, international customary law, the way that states act, the way that they present themselves internationally, if it's consistent, even though they didn't write their name, they didn't sign the document, it shows that they are de facto complying with it and de facto bound by it. But there's always that risk that in the end, the states might one day decide to derogate from their practice and as a result reject it. And that's one of the risks within international law, which often pops up. And yeah, I guess moving on to question 2 then, how does the right to health intersect with other human rights, AJ? I know we did speak a bit about it, but what about from, say, a privacy perspective and health data?
Yeah, I think this is super important. And it's not just privacy, right? But bodily autonomy and informed consent. So I think space is going to be a place where we may see people have to give away some type of rights, right? Like maybe you have to give up some privacy rights when you are in space long term, because that's just the nature of being in space, right? So maybe you have,
Absolutely. And astronauts have a whole team of people underground looking after them as well, and need access to all of that data as well in order to make informed decisions, right?
yeah, constant monitoring. Or you think about the ability to refuse treatment, which is part of the right to health, right? Your ability to make your own medical decisions. Do you have that same freedom of choice when you are in space? I think those are, to your point, John, those are questions we don't have the answer to right now. We haven't had to experience those situations. And so it's really hard to predict what those protections look like, need to be shaped like. You talked about privacy. In the US, we have this law called HIPAA that most people don't fully understand what it does and how it protects your data. But it's actually a very narrow law in terms of who it impacts with sharing of medical data. But I think it's going to be incredibly interesting, especially as we have people in space more long term, right? So usually people aren't in space more than 6 to 9 months at a time. I know some people have done it for over a year, like people have the record of however many days, but typically speaking, we're not putting people in space for years or decades at a time, but eventually we will do that. And something that I've been thinking about, John, I don't know if you've been thinking about, because we haven't talked about it, is what the research looks like and what data is collected in order to see how space is impacting human bodies, right? Do you have the option to say, well, I don't want you to study me and I don't want you to have my medical information, my medical data?
Absolutely. I think as we have more private space companies and commercial astronauts growing up as well, this will become an even more apparent issues for, like, say if you have space tourists going up there, and as part of the agreement they sign with SpaceX or with Blue Origin, is that they consent to their data being collected and then being used for commercial purposes. That opens up a new risk area with regards to human rights as well.
Yeah, and you don't even know what those commercial purposes could be long term, right? I think that's really interesting. And I think from a cultural perspective, when we think about the right to health post life in terms of cultural rituals and how people bury their dead, their loved ones, how whether or not they're burying them at all, right? Whatever rituals they have, I think that's another thing. Like, do you have the option for that? Will you be allowed to make those decisions? Something that I've thought about. I haven't written about it, but I've thought about it a little bit. Is the passing rituals for people who will eventually die in space. I don't know if you've done as much thinking about that as I have, John, but that's something I think about too, right? Because I think normally people don't think about that as the right to health, but to your point, right, that's still your bodily autonomy, the choices you want to make after you're dead. You have legal protections like wills and things like that, but are those applicable in space? Are they enforceable? So I will stop talking and let you answer what you kind of think about that side of the right to health and bodily autonomy, after you die.
Absolutely. I mean, dealing with the right to afterlife, you're also dealing with not just disposal of your body, but also dealing with the challenges of outer space context as well. You're dealing with temporal challenges, like you die in one area of, say, far away, and how long will that take for your death to be communicated to your relatives in another area of space as well, and then dealing with the data as well, which everyone leaves a digital footprint behind as well when they pass, and who has rights over your access to your accounts online, your data online, and all of that. And that's something which is parallel, not just on Earth, but I see will arise as well as we have more and more people going into outer space. And yeah, just moving on to the next question, Patton. What are the key health concerns associated with outer space living, AJ?
But everything. So I come from a disability education background. So space as an environment is disabling. It is a dangerous place, right? I don't want to say scary because I'm not scared, but it's a very dangerous, unpredictable place, right? So space is a disabling environment as soon as you get there. So that includes things like radiation, depending on where you are. And do you have the right to be protected from space radiation or not? Does that impact how your suits are designed? Does that, like, do we have, you talked about private space companies and space tourism. Are there going to be standards for how thick their suits have to be to protect from radiation or microgravity or macrogravity? I think those are two really big things, is radiation and gravity. But I also think your access to drinkable water, right? I think that's a huge hazard. Clean water, are we going to have the ability to either create water or clean water, whatever we have to do. And, is that right going to be able to be protected, especially with private companies? I think that's the huge issue, is the private companies and what they're going to do or not do. But I think all of those things are incredibly important to at least attempt to protect.
Absolutely. I guess just from a structured perspective, you mentioned the environmental hazard of space radiation, but we're also just, I guess, in the outer space context, we're also looking at isolation and confinement by people living in enclosed space and habitats. You're looking at the effects of distance from Earth and distance from your relatives and all of that, and finally as well the gravity fields as well, like we're going to discuss soon. And this leads to a variety of health implications on the individuals. Obviously, muscle atrophy and bone density loss, where seen astronauts lose about 20% of loss of muscle mass after living for prolonged periods on the ISS. Looking at vision impairment, like spaceflight associated neuroocular syndrome, or physiological challenges as well. How it affects the mental state of astronauts, not just during the mission, but also dealing with post-mission treatment and care as well. And who would be responsible for this prolonged post-mission treatment and care of astronauts. And then you're also dealing with the unexpected potential for pathogens as well within outer space, living with each other in close proximity and in closed spaces, and dealing with differing standards of hygiene across different cultures and peoples as well, and how that would lead to increased health implications for astronauts, commercial astronauts, and space tourists in the near future.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up the isolation and confinement, John, and also the post-flight treatment and responsibilities, especially for those who will have depression, anxiety, all other types of mental health disabilities. But I also think the right to health should protect the people who get to go, because when you think about the people who are tested and deemed fit to go, a lot of times they exclude people that have mental health disabilities or other kinds of disabilities, cognitive disabilities. But to your point about isolation and confinement, those people may actually be better for long-term space missions where they are isolated and confined. And so, extending the right to health from a disability inclusion or equity lens, right? Like, are the people who have historically been excluded because of their mental health disabilities being protected with the opportunity to go to space, right? Because again, like we've said, we don't know how these environments will impact people's mental states. We don't know, how folks are going to do long-term in these environments that can be really hostile. To your point, John, there could be a lack of communication. Some people do well with not having to communicate with loved ones for an extended period of time. Some don't. So I think that's another part of it, right? It's not just forward thinking, but also who we're allowing to go to space and what type of, quote unquote, health and healthy people we're allowing to go to space, I think is a huge question too.
Yes, and also the potential of dealing with COVID in space. We'll see.
Yeah. I don't know if you can do a ton of social distancing in our current spacecrafts.
Awesome. And just to the next question then, what steps have governments so far taken to support health and safety in outer space from a human rights perspective?
I mean, there's a ton of health safety standards to go to space, right? That's one of the I don't know, good, bad, exclusionary parts of space is that they're really stringent on, who can go, how they can go, making sure that things are decontaminated, like NASA, ESA, Roscosmos, they all, like, JAXA, they all have standards of safety and health. So yeah, there's that. To your point, like, people are constantly being monitored in space, constantly having teams check up on them. I think that is good, but I don't know if that's what we are talking about when we're talking about a right to health, right? I think those are our safety standards that are necessary to ensure the success of missions, not necessarily safety standards put there from a human rights perspective. I mean, they could accomplish the same things at the end of the day, right? But I don't think they're doing that from a human rights perspective, unless you think they are.
I think so. One of the measures which governments have, you could say, have taken is within international collaboration for safety, where they collaborate through organizations like obviously the IHS partnership, but also in coordinating against standards as well. So you're looking at the international standards organization, say ISO 16158, dealing with space systems and avoiding collisions among orbiting objects, and all these interrelated elements as well. And another area as well would be, I think, within training and simulation, we've seen international analog astronaut experiments as well, like the NASA's 2022 Crew Health and Performance Acceleration Analog, or CHAPA, I think it was, and dealing with 1 year Mars simulated environments for a variety of the NASA employees as well. And we also have international astronauts, astronaut candidates who go to NASA's Space Johnson Flight Center in order to train there in microgravity environments and in emergency situations, how they would respond in those contexts. Awesome. All right, so final question for this section. So what are some interrelated human rights which may apply to health in space?
So we've talked about a few of these, right? There's Article 3 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says that everyone has the right to life, also liberty and the security of person. There's Article 6 of the ICCPR, which is the Convention on Civil and Political Rights, that says every human being has the inherent right to life. There's also Article 11 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which says that everyone has the right to an adequate standard of living. But I also think one of the treaties that also reinforces this is the entire Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities and what they have access to. Like I said, space is a disabling environment. So what access to resources and care and supports do those folks have? Are we making sure that if people become disabled in space or by space, that they're not discriminated against and still have access to an adequate standard of living and to care? Because quite frankly, we don't always do that here on Earth, right? And so I think all of those sections kind of reinforce the right to life and health. And then you have things like, I think someone put in the chat the SDGs. There's the right to health and sustainable environment. We haven't really talked about sustainability and what that means in terms of a right to health. But I mean, there's more too. I don't know if you want to talk about the right to water, the right to breathable atmosphere as part of the right to a healthy environment, healthy and sustainable environment.
Absolutely. I mean, when we look at space, transporting basic elements required to sustain human life, water, air, is something which takes up volume and which will therefore cost a lot of money, and then raises questions as to who's going to pay for it. I mean, with governments, that's no problem, but when you're looking more to the private sector as well, there's potentially going to be cost-cutting measures there, and that's where human rights comes in order to provide core fundamental principles that human rights business entities must adhere to. And I mean, within the UN, you have the United Nations Guiding Principles for businesses on human rights issues, you're also dealing with, say, the right to water. You have it covered under Article 12 of the International Covenant on Civil, Economic, and Cultural Rights, and dealing with as well the right to clean air, which is developed as well under the right to a healthy and sustainable environment. You're looking at states being obliged to monitor air quality and health effects, public reporting on air quality, establishing air quality legislations, and so forth. And this, while it's focused mainly upon that first intersection of human rights and space, as how we're dealing with rights at the moment on Earth, it does bear long-term implications for how we will look to support the supply of basic elements required for life for astronauts into the future as well, surrounding clean air and water, and in that sense, not just clean air as well, but as stated within the paper that is on our website, The Right to a Breathable Atmosphere, there's a variety of elements which are required beyond just clean air, dealing with, say, the different composition of the atmosphere provided. I know NASA uses 100% oxygen supply, and then different space agencies would maybe use as standard atmospheric composition, 71% oxygen, 21% nitrogen, and so forth. And yeah, this raises a variety of opportunities for governments to coordinate looking into the future. All right, and on to our final set of questions, AJ. So firstly, how does the absence of gravity in space impact the right to health for astronauts?
Yeah, someone just asked in the chat, and Rowena answered about the ability to heal in space and how the gravity impacts wound healing and things like that. I think again, we haven't sent enough people in space, and to repeat, John, there haven't been enough accidents. I don't mean like really bad accidents, but kind of regular accidents that happen every day that we've learned to deal with over centuries here on Earth, millennia here on Earth. They haven't happened in space, and we don't know how to address them. Something I think about, John, is like, what if someone breaks their arm, right? Or breaks a limb, breaks a bone, and maybe we can put a cast on and reset it. But how does the gravity, the microgravity, the lack of gravity impact how the bones set, how they heal? I don't have the answers to these questions at all. I'm not a medical expert. I'm not Rowena. I'm not a doctor. So I think it's important to think about, how this will impact how we do healthcare in space. But for me, I don't know the answers. I come from a legal background, so I don't come from a physiological background or an anatomical background. So I don't necessarily know. But I do think that is really important to think about. And I don't know what to do with that one. That's a hard question for me.
So, say beyond the medical treatment side of things, say how would it affect the provision of health services like ambulances in space, for example, or medical equipment in space? Provision of medical equipment in space. So,
yeah, I think part of that is training professionals who can do that, who know how to use those tools, having the ability and the creativity to create new tools that may work better, be more effective. I think you already talked a little bit about muscle atrophy. If you're in space long term, how do we prevent that or negate that? What does it mean to have a fitness regimen in space in order to prevent those things? Like, is part of your right to health the responsibility to do certain exercises in space, right? Whether that's yoga, calisthenics, I don't know. It's it's hard to do like, weightlifting or something like that, depending on the gravity of your environment. Or maybe it's not if you're in a macro gravity environment, right? And you have to strengthen. I think there's all different types of potential changes we need to make to our current healthcare, and maybe the things we learn in space about human physiology can help us have better healthcare and access to care here on Earth.
Yeah, and just building on from that as well, I think we have to, international human rights, from the international human rights perspective, we have to also look at the potential long-term impacts of gravity post-mission upon the human body, and how states must be required to provide post-mission health services. Again, dealing with, we've all seen the videos of astronauts landing after spending a prolonged period on the International Space Station, and they can't stand up. They have to be carried from their capsule when they first land back on Earth. And yeah, how does that affect humans in the long term moving forward? I mean, it is something which is still is still being researched and analyzed. And moving on to question 2 then, what interrelated rights do you think support a human rights-based approach to gravity in space, AJ?
I think we already talked about the right to life. I think when you think about, safety, how you're building your habitats, I think about people like Britt Duffy Atkins from Celestial Citizen, who's a space urban planner, and how we design our environments. And I think if you really want to extend out what the right to health looks like, that includes how you design your environments, right? How folks have to access things and navigate their space vehicles or spacecrafts, or even potentially their lunar bases. You think about the access
Economics. Economics and universal design.
You think about the access to healthcare, which we talked about, and what that means. How long are you going to have to wait to get care in space? Is it something where you always have to have some type of medical professional or doctor on long-term missions, or someone gets sent out if there's a medical emergency? Does everyone on the crew have to have basic safety training? So basic CPR training, basic wound dressing training. What does that look like when crew sizes get bigger? When there are plans for multiple lunar bases, right? When you're on the lunar base, what that care looks like and what that access to care looks like is going to be really interesting. Is that going to limit who can go? Only people who have passed the trainings, have a minimum amount of knowledge so that you can do basic healthcare? I think all of those are questions. And then you have, obviously, this safety precautions and protocols and how those are designed and set up, and what the punishments are for not adhering to those.
Yeah, definitely. I think one additional area would be the right to work as well, and its interrelationship with the right to health, and how gravity will affect the right to work in space from a health perspective. And say dealing with, like you said, specialist skill sets and training for medical personnel to navigate the challenges posed by altered gravity environments, dealing with innovative work environments, and dealing with the provision of specialized equipment to work within these varied gravity environments, and dealing with psychological, physiological adaptation as well, dealing with an astronaut's ability to perform certain work-related tasks effectively. And this all relates to the right to work as encapsulated under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 23, stating that everyone has the right to work, free employment of choice, just and favorable conditions of work, and to protection against unemployment. And in that sense, it focuses upon just and favorable conditions of work, and how do we ensure that from a labor rights perspective in space moving forward.
And I think talking about work on the rights of migrants and migrant workers, and how the commercial space sector is probably going to need service workers, and what that favorable work condition means, right? And how do you do that at an international level, especially with private companies? So obviously, private companies from different states are going to have different levels of worker protections and workers' rights. But how do we set standards and norms at the international level for the minimums? I think it is really important to think about when we're talking about the right to work, especially with migrant workers, and how they oftentimes aren't protected in ways that they should.
Absolutely. And moving along now, how does human rights intersect with technological development infrastructure to simulate gravity in space habitats.
To your point, universal design, how we're designing and testing things. We already talked about making sure that we're being inclusive of people with different abilities, disabilities, different body types, how we are designing for those people. Can we design to include those people? What are the economic implications of that? What are the technological implications of that? So are we asking the people who are doing tech design, tech infrastructure, physical infrastructure for spacecraft and bases and things like that, are we asking them to use universal design to make sure that they are creating spaces where people of all different bodies, minds, abilities have access to them and can access them safely and in a healthy way? I think that's a huge thing. And part of that design is, we talked about isolation, right? But personal property is a thing, right? The ability to have personal space. What are your rights in terms of that? Do you have personal property rights in space? Like fundamentally you do, but if you're on a ship or a mission or things like that, how much do you have to share? Do you have to share sleeping spaces, sleeping quarters? Are you entitled to your own sleeping quarters? Probably not. I think there are lots of different questions that intersect with how we're designing things, but also the tech we're inventing in order to go to space.
And I think as well, to add on top of that, I think there's a need for ethical guidelines and principles across research as to how human beings would adapt to different gravitational environments, space. I mean, technology simulating gravity should undergo ethical assessments in order to ensure compliance with human rights standards, particularly when testing on human subjects as well.
Yeah. John, I know we have a few more questions, but I also think we want to give time to the audience. I know we've been talking a lot.
Yeah, I think we should probably open up to the audience. But yeah, I'm happy to accept any questions from the chat. Would you be able to read them out to us, AJ or Rena?
There are a few comments. I think all the
Or would they
questions.
like to raise their hand within Zoom, and then we can do that?
I did see a question where someone asked if you take inspiration from science fiction.
Absolutely. Okay, we'll start with that one then. So yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the main reasons I got into space and space law eventually is definitely because of science fiction, watching shows like Stargate, Star Wars, and The Expanse. And there was this one scene that I often mention is the opening episode of The Expanse, where you're dealing with this belter, this rebel, who's grown up in a zero-G environment all his life, and he's just being tortured by being left on Earth standard gravity, hanging from hooks. They're not doing anything to him, but it's just the gravity which is affecting that pain and physiological discomfort. And in that sense, where does human rights fit into that picture? And draws in civil and political, draws in historical and intergenerational questions as well surrounding his upgrowing his development within a zero-G environment. And yes, so those are my sort of inspirations. AJ?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I'm necessarily inspired by science fiction. I think something that I have to deal with a lot, and John, I'm sure you have to deal with it too, is when we're talking about human rights in space, we have to push back against the idea that it's super far off for science fiction and that it's actually applicable in real hard law. So when I tell people that, your privacy rights are impacted by remote sensing right now with all the satellites and technology, it's not, when I say human rights in space, it's super futuristic or anything like that. It's really applicable right now, and it's a field that is really important to the development of future space activities and humanity's future in space. So I love science fiction as well, but as a professional, oftentimes I'm accused of doing science fiction when actually I'm doing actual academic space work and legal work. So I don't know if you have that same problem.
Any other questions?
There's a question here. What about animal rights in space?
Okay, that's a tough one. I mean, in reality, animals are considered property at the moment, right? And I mean, there's philosophical questions surrounding sentience, surrounding how we deal with non-human entities and all of that, and that's more science fiction based, unfortunately. AJ?
I would say that historically, animal rights haven't been protected in space. At least, way back when.
Like, yes, the first dog, the Soviet dog.
Well, it's not just dogs, right? We've sent a bunch of different animals to space. I don't think any of them have been able to give consent, right? And so I think humanity as a whole has a real issue with the idea. To your point, John, about what's sentient and what deserves rights and what deserves protections. But I think that space is an opportunity to explore that. Do people have the right, like John, you said, from a legal perspective, people do have the right to take their personal property to space, and that would include a pet or an animal. But would that be torture to the animal? Is that right? Is that ethical? I think, unfortunately, right now, the idea of animal rights in space falls more into ethics than it does legality.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the threads that you can unpack there is that the way that we treat others, the way that we treat animals, definitely reflects upon our individual humanity and dignity, and how we can draw that into how we practice human rights moving forward as well. But yeah, any other questions? If we do have a bit of time, we'll just address maybe question 5 here as our last topic, I guess, between AJ and myself. So AJ, what ethical decisions arise in determining the long-term effects of altered gravity on human reproduction and the rights of future generations?
Yeah, thank you, Rowena, for giving us the time. I know other people have to go, but I think this is a really important question when we talk about the long-term sustainability of human populations in space, especially as people start to reproduce in space or off Earth or on other celestial bodies. And there's just a ton, right? Is it ethical to even reproduce in space and to have birth in space? I think that intergenerational question of justice and equity, and is it right to even do that? When you talk about informed consent, right, and knowledge, you talk about data privacy. Should people be required to disclose that they are pregnant before they go to space? Can we prevent people from going to space if they are pregnant? What are the implications of? We already talked about bodily autonomy. Reproductive autonomy is part of that as well. I think there's so many different things. I want to talk about it, but I know I kind of just rattled off a few of those.
I mean, looking to the potential risks to offspring, that's where we bring in that issue of intergenerational justice and informed consent and autonomy. I mean, your children, they're not being born at the moment. They can't consent since they're not born yet. And how do you deal with that issue, that potential effect of gravity upon their, say, genetics as well? I mean, we're seeing how living in different gravity environments affects physiological conditions, which will then flow on to affect potential genetic modification from moving forward down the line as well. And ethical dilemmas arise there concerning equitable access to space habitation and potential medical interventions and healthcare. And in adapting to these zero gravity environments, or the use of genetic modification to ensure that people grow up healthy and strong within these different gravity environments as well, raises questions about fairness, equity, and potential alteration of human genomes for future generations. Awesome. Any final comments, AJ?
No, thank y'all so much. I know we're behind, and sorry that we weren't able to save more time to get us back caught up to schedule. But thank you so much for having us, Rowena. As always, I appreciate it. Thank you, John, for all the insightful questions and thought-provoking questions.
Thank you, Rowena.
Thank you both so much for coming along today. That was really fantastic, and hopefully we can do it again another time and go into some of these really thought-provoking questions in greater detail, which would be terrific. So thanks again.
Thanks, Rowena.
Thank you. Bye for now.